Good evening everybody, and welcome to this webinar from Contact Family. This webinar is called I Need to Know, and it's a brief summary and overview of the Children and Families Act 2014. Please bear with us if there is a technical hitch. We do hope that we won't have any as we go along, but please do bear with us if there is any difficulty with this. For those of you that are joining us, you should be able to see a slide that is titled I Need to Know, the Children and Families Act 2004. Just to let you know, as we go through the webinar today, that as participants you are muted just because of the amount of participants that we have. So it isn't practical, unfortunately, for us to have verbal questions throughout the webinar as we go. However, if you do have questions, please use the question icon that is on the toolbar on your screen, and that allows you to type in the questions and submit it to the administrator. We will answer at the end as many questions as we can. If there are similar questions, we will try and condense these where possible. If there are questions that we don't have time to cover in the session, and sometimes questions come in but we don't actually receive them until after we've finished the webinar, we will make sure that we answer as many of them as we can and put the answers on the website. You'll also be able to watch this webinar on our Contact Family website. It will be published in the next week or so if you want to go through and review it and watch any parts again. At the end of the webinar, there'll also be a short questionnaire, and we would really appreciate it if you would take your time to complete that, because it helps us as we plan and develop the future online training events. We'd really like to know if you found this helpful or not, or if there's been any difficulties with you accessing it through the webinar format that we use. My name is Sue North and I work for Contact Family. We've been really pleased to work with Early Support to deliver these I Need to Know sessions, and we've delivered these in various places across England, but we know that there are lots of families that haven't been able to get to those, or they've not been in your local area. So we hope this webinar, although it's short, just gives you a quick overview about that. Because we do only have an hour today, and because of how limited we are with the questions, we can't answer questions about your individual child. However, if following this you have questions about how these reforms will impact on your child or your own situation, then please make sure that you contact our free telephone helpline on 0800 808 3555, and you can call us. That's a free helpline, or you can also email into us. So I'd like to pass you over now to Caroline Tomlinson, who is going to deliver our session. At the end of the presentation, I will come back and ask the questions that you've submitted as we've gone along. So I hope that you enjoy and find this helpful.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Caroline Tomlinson. I live in the northwest of England in Wigan, and was really why I'm involved in this is because my eldest son Joe, who's 26 years old now, he contracted meningococcal meningitis at the age of 6 months, which left him with a huge range of complex disabilities. Typically, we didn't have a diagnosis to get into the service system, although we saw he presented many challenges to the system. He was typically also somebody that didn't really fit into what I would describe as service land, and went through many struggles over many years to try and work out what was the best type of support and education and health and care for him in the future. I was very much involved in the whole innovation around the personalisation agenda, the new Care Act that's coming to be, and the reforms with the Children's Act, and many other ways in terms of really looking at individuals as individuals, children and young people who need person-centred, personalised support around them. So I'm really pleased to be involved in the Contact Family webinar this evening, because this means a lot to me personally. And including Joe was one of the first people in the country to experience a personal budget, and arguably has had education health care plan over many years, but now as an adult really just takes a personal budget and has a really great plan that offers him great a good life. So let's move on and let's really look at how the Children's Act implicates, I guess, and gives you the opportunity to make a difference for you and for your children. So what we hope to achieve from today is that you'll go understanding what the Children and Families Act is and how it changes the way children and young people with special educational needs or disability, the acronym being used, SEND, are supported. So you'll hear those letters and those words probably mentioned quite a lot. We also want to ensure that you go away understanding how those changes will affect you and your child, because this is a bigger picture than just about the child and the young person. Visiting families too. So there we go, the Children and Families Act of 2014. And really let's have a little think about why those changes were actually needed. Well, some clear points of what information has been gathered over time, that often parents and carers struggle to find the right services that should be helping them. People often talk about fighting or battling to get the help that their children need. And we'll tell everybody about how they have to regurgitate those stories many times. And I can understand that and really empathise that. I'm probably one of those people that have said that time and time again. So things need to be joined up and much more clearer for people to actually reach the goal and their children to reach their outcomes. A really big issue, and certainly for me this was why we set out about really trying to change the system, was this thing called transition. That thing about moving from being a child into adult services can be extremely difficult, and the time it can take for that to happen can be very stressful at that time. So how do you create that much smoother and a much more planned process? Other evidence showed that the amount of money spent by local authorities was not necessarily leading to the improvements or outcomes for children, and therefore was that real value for money. And also lots of felt that their children's needs were still not being met. And really this isn't just a minority group of people. These issues affect an awful lot of people. We believe 1 in 5 children are currently identified as having some form of special educational need or disability, with 2.8% having a more complex need. So really the population that this may impact on can be quite significant. So, most of the Act was implemented in September 2014, but like any pieces of legislation, they take time to embed, they take time for processes and policies to be put into place on a local level. But very much a local authority should be driving this agenda forward now, and plans should start to be made. Now then, in terms of really influencing the Act and the shape of the Act, was very clear that the parent carer forums across England fed into the initial thinking, the development, and the Act itself and the code of practice. So rather than you kind of being, this is very much another top-down process, there is quite a bit of evidence to suggest that this was actually families on the ground feeding that information up. How that's interpreted may be invested in different ways with the outcomes from the Act as time goes along. So it's really thinking that you should have confidence and faith in actually keeping your voice within those parent-carer forums and movements across the country. The ambition, now then, the Department for Education wants all children and young people to achieve well in their early years at school and in college. Ultimately, longer term, finding employment, leading happy and fulfilled lives, and have choice and control over their support. Now, I can't really argue that. The ambition may feel really sort of ambitious in many ways, but how do we make this really practical and possible for children and young people with a high and a wide range of disabilities and needs, and how do we work through some of this stuff in much more creative ways to really achieve the things that they want to achieve in life. The reforms are designed to implement a new approach which seeks up the health and sort of the joining across education, health and care. And interestingly, it's a wider stretch from talking is from birth right up to 25 years. So that's really extended the breadth and the impact of the Act. Help will be offered at the earliest possible point with children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities and their parents and carers fully involved in decisions about their support and what they want to achieve. So it's a holistic view with families really involved at the heart of that. This, we believe, with the help towards leading better outcomes and more efficient and effective ways of working. So ultimately, children grow up into adults as young people achieve hopes, dreams and ambitions. So who, what, where, how, why, all them kind of questions spinning through your mind, and how's this going to impact on me? What difference is it going to make to me and my child? Is this about changing everything for the sake of change? Or really is it about a positive way forward? Lots of questions we know, and so let's go on to try and answer some of them. And of course there's the opportunity for questions later on at the end of the webinar. So we talk first of all about the definitions of a child who fits into this SEND. A child or a young person has special educational needs if they have a learning difficulty or disability, which calls for special educational provision to be made for them. And that's around section 20 of the Children and Families Act of 2014, if you want to look at that actual phrase legislation. The key changes are going to be about children and young people, parent carers at the heart of the assessment and the planning. So nothing about us without us is the kind of phrase that's to mind. It's really about that changing in culture, the changes around the way that we assess and then we develop the plan, and all that really kind of focusing on using an approach of person-centeredness. How do we truly involve and look at the child and see the child and young person? How do we think and look at and involve the family within that process? So arguably, if we're truly person-centered, no one plan should actually look exactly the same. There may be similarities, but actually if we're truly person-centered, it would be centered around that individual child and young person. We're also interested in focusing on the outcomes. What will come out of this for your child or young person? So outcomes, what are we hoping to achieve? And they can be really huge, big outcomes, or they could be small, tiny steps. And that should be reviewed as an ongoing process to ensure that the plan continues to work for that child or young person. Now, the section 19 within this kind of whole act, the authority must have regards to the views, the wishes, the feelings of the child, young person and their parents. It's really important to ensure that people are allowed to participate in decisions relating to themselves or their child. So a real forcing legislation to include the voice of families. There's a real big emphasis on the importance of providing information to enable active participation making. So informed decision making, so you have all the information that you require to be able to make that decision. And the need to support the child, young person and their parents to facilitate the development and enable the best possible outcomes, which is not just about education, it's the wider context of life. So good quality outcomes to live, what you would derive as from a good life for your child, young person. Of course, there's going to be regional and local variations, and that's good because, in different places people want and require different things. And what each local authority expects to do is to provide information on education, health and care in that local area, and that is known as the local offer. What is on offer for me for my child, for me to actually look at, that we can actually tap into. Because one of the things that we say around the traditional service systems, quite often people have only been offered the colour red. What we're actually saying now, there's a wide range of things to buy or things that might be free at the point of delivery. What we should have is the rainbow of options available to you on a local level. And all that information should be, and is stated within the Act, on a website. So finding that website, how accessible that is, and feeding your views into the local offer is really key and important. So if you think something's missing, you need to tell the local authority, and they start to look at, does that exist, or even support voluntary organisations, different organisations, to create where there is gaps and where there is a need. Children and young people, as I just said, and parents and carers must in developing the local offer. So it's, what do we want, what do we require, what do we need locally to meet needs of our children? And that could be in the wider context, not just in education. It might be social opportunities, things for kids, children and young people, opportunities to do stuff alongside others. You know, what is available to local people. The local offer also extends that parents and young people can comment on local authority commissioning in light of this. So once the local offer is in situ, it isn't that that's fixed in stone. It should evolve, it should develop. The whole market of opportunity, if you like, should start to increase as more things become available. And, you know, that's a big challenge to set that up in the first instance. But what we could see is new types of innovative and creative services evolving. Local offer should also include eligibility and criteria for their services. So really not leading people up the garden path, being absolutely clear and direct who can access what is the great thing about the local offer and how that's actually shown and demonstrated to you. So special educational needs support, previously School Action and School Action Plus have now become one category of support within mainstream schools. So really all embodying, bringing all this stuff together to actually formalise and look through the Children's Act in the EHC Plans. So the Education, Health and Care Plans you'll hear to be referred to as EHC Plans. And that will be a common acronym again used for that. So who are they for? Children with significant and complex needs, used to having a statement of special educational needs, and this often became a learning difficulty assessment when they turned 16 to 18 to 19, left school to go further educational college. So all those people in that category fit into the EHC plan as they start the transfer across. Education, health and care plans will replace statements of special educational needs, but you will not be left in the middle without anything. You only transfer from the statement once your EHC plan has been completed and in place. And education, health and care plans will replace the learning difficulty assessment. So it's really, you know, one kicks in as the day, the other one ends. There is no gap. You're left without nothing. That isn't the case. It's about a clear process of transferring from one system to another. And the legislation is very clear about that, as is the code of practice. So there's, now, interestingly about the EHC plan, there's going to be no national pro forma for an education health care plan. Now, what that's all about is coming back to that concept of person-centeredness, because arguably, if we're really person-centered, how would that fit into a standard form? So it isn't about having a form or a pro forma, it's about working towards some clear guidance about different elements or sections that should be included in one education, health and care plan. And indeed, if your child or young person wants to be involved in the design of that, that's absolutely fine. We need to involve and include children and young people wherever possible to ensure that we get their views in there. Areas, what we found, have designed usually and hopefully with their parent carers what their EHC plan would look like. And really it's about connecting in, speaking to other people, maybe speaking to people that have already gone through some of this process, because some early people are already going through the EHC process, and have a conversation with what that actually looks like, and how did that feel? What did I need to learn from that? What can I learn from that? EHC assessments or education health care assessments, there is a time scale that they need to adhere to, which actually should be completed within 20 weeks. Now, of course, that's broken down into different sections. So there's an early bit in terms of does this person actually have needs around education, health and care in terms of eligibility, particularly around education elements. 6 weeks to work that stuff out. There's another 6 weeks around completing the assessment process. And then, still in the same way that you did with the statement, you have an opportunity to read that as a family, to comment on that, and there's a 15-day comment process around that, with hopefully the final plan signed off and completed within 20 weeks. And from the plan being completed, that's a legal document that should be actioned from that process. So it's really kind of pretty straightforward, although there's always going to be different nuances and complexities within that. But you know, that's what we're looking for in terms of legislation, a 20-week process from start to finish.
So you may have heard a lot about personal budgets. These have been around for a while and people have been talking about them for a while. Personal budgets, direct payments. Now, what does this really mean for many of us, and how will this actually work? So personal budgets are available to those with the EHC, the Education Health Care Plans. And some elements of the personal budgets may be able to be taken as a direct payment. Going through the process of the planning and the thinking what's going to be in the content of your EHC plan, there may be different options that you want to choose that have more flexibility, more choice and control over. So for example, it might be that one of your child might want to go to Cubs or to Brownies, and you may need some flexible support to allow them to be supported in the local community centre, etc. You can really start to think about that as part of the EHC plan, and start to think that that might be an element that you could take out as a personal budget, or indeed a cash direct payment. I think the thing to think about is practical and possible, and actually a little bit out of the box. So different aspects of their care is much easier to shift and move as a personal budget, rather than actually thinking we could take the whole of the therapy services out, for example, which would be much more complicated. It's allowing that kind of care element really, but that's not to say it gets restricted in the care bit. There could be a little bit more flexibility around health need, and certainly around education. But what I'd advise anybody to do is, as you're going through that EHC process, and whoever is helping you to plan, get them to explain to you how it works locally, maybe give you some stories and some real examples of how that could be working. In terms of increasing how long young people are supported, so for many, many years we talked about children and young people being age 18 and under. But what we know in our modern day world is many young people stay on to education much longer than their 18th birthday. Indeed, many schools are still offering support for young people up to the 19th year. Now, the interesting thing with the Children's Act, the stretch in terms of the EHC plan, the Education Health Care Plan, can continue until a young person is aged 25. So that's a huge stretch. But there's some caveats with this. Only when young people remain in further education, so that's a college type of learning type of environment, or what could be seen as education or indeed training to enable them to meet their outcomes. Unfortunately, in terms of education at universities, this wouldn't apply. But really thinking about that stretch up to 25, really thinking about that with the EHC plans within that transition, that there could be a really useful opportunity for you to use the plan to enable that young person to get some really great training that would lead them on into adult life and go through a really smooth transition if you can stretch that out up to 25. So it's a great new offer and a great new opportunity, I guess, to try and embed some real positive training and learning for our children and young people.
Can we resolve matters on a local level, can we bring an independent mediator in to help work that through? Can we find a process of resolution, solution for that situation? So when local authorities make decisions about an assessment or a plan, so imagine you've gone through the 20-week assessment and the plan has been completed, they've got to inform parents and carers of the right to access independent mediation. And that is something that should actually come out with all plans. Now then, in terms of appeal, you can appeal to the tribunal about education elements of the plan. Parents and young people have been provided with information about mediation, so there'll be somebody to contact, funded again by the local authority. But if you have an issue about appeal in relation to health or social care elements of the plan, you would have to use the separate social care and health processes of appeal. So different pieces of legislation may apply to different aspects of the plan. So it's not completely disregarding everything that's gone before. There'll be different processes in place around complaints and also around appeal. So it's really trying to get somebody to help you work through that. You know, so if it's a particular issue, getting some advice or some independent advice, what people will really help. Who do you need to speak to in that context? That brings me on to information, advice and support. And there's a duty on local authorities, to provide information, advice and support. And it should be jointly commissioned to cover education, health and social care. So hopefully a joined up approach to that information, advice and support. Because sometimes it's really hard to work out who do I need to speak to for what. Services extended to disabled children, young people and those with special educational needs. There should be some stuff locally for you. And what you'll find is, find out before you need it, is who's going to be responsible for providing that information, advice and support. In some instances, maybe that local authority connection. In others, it could be voluntary organisations. You need to find the link with that. Also, a big fund that's been allowed for independent support. So funding from the government, and that has come through the Council for Disabled Children. We've heard quite a lot of fact sheets on this, that people have an entitlement to independent support. And we believe that there's about 1,800 independent supporters that have been trained up across the country. That's approximately thinking there'll be 12 per local authority area. How realistic that is, we're not sure, but there should be some access to independent support locally, and that might depend on how big your local authority area is. So the Council of Disabled Children, there'll be information on that. The independent support is about being time limited, and it's about really creating that resilience and giving you advice around personal budgets and all them different areas. And all those independent supporters have all been trained up, but it's a case of, you know, those people are in situ. That's going to be monitored and reviewed to see how effective it is. So it's really important, if you use an independent supporter, to give your feedback to help evolve and develop that service. How can you have a say in what is happening locally? Well, most local areas have parent-carer forums, which are made up of parent carers of children with special educational needs and disabilities, and will work with the local authority about different elements of the reforms. Now, in the age of technology, in this very clever way of we use electronic systems, it doesn't mean to say that you have to attend every parent-carer forum and be physically present in meetings. Maybe you want to have your voice heard through different means of communication, maybe through email, through using social media, all them different stretches that you can have the opportunity to have your say. But really, we all have a responsibility to feed in our views into the parent-carer forum and really getting people. But of course it's our responsibility to do that, so please do wherever possible, whether it's good stuff or whether it's not so good stuff. We need to feed that in, and then services can start to evolve and develop from that. If the more people have the voice, it's much easier then to say, X amount of people want this type of thing, and then that really can influence change. So I guess believe in possibility is my advice around that, and do have your say if you possibly can have anything to say on all this, which I'm sure you do. You can have your say on what's happening local. I've just said through the National Network of Parent Carer Forums. They're all linked up to a national level. So we've got local parent carer forums, there's regional stuff, there's national stuff. So there is a very clear line if you like. So actually get not just your local voice in the local area heard, if it's something around the change of policy or influencing something much greater. Is the link there to feed that right up into the national system as required. But of course what we want is still retaining our local stuff and our local bits, as well as feeding into those national areas as well. Of course, this is really underpinned by senior politicians right across, I would say, different areas, the different kind of politicians right across the different parties. And if you're interested, there's the link. Edward Timpson, who is the Undersecretary of State Children and Families, there's a little YouTube clip worth watching to actually try and demonstrate that they are really behind these changes. So maybe after the webinar today, you might want to hear what Edward's got to say. Of course, there's lots of information available. There is the Special Education Disability, a guide for parents and carers published by the government. There'll be more and more different types of fact sheets coming up. People find these really useful. If you do, or you're thinking there's a fact sheet missing, feed that into the forum, feed it into Contact a Family. They've also got a whole range of fact sheets too. And, you know, are they being written in a way that you find easy to understand? Is it answering the questions that you've got? I guess them are the sorts of things that we really do need to feed in. And sometimes the question is a little bit more complicated than what you can answer on a fact sheet. So please do use the information, helplines, you know, the Contact a Family helpline, really useful just to get a bit underneath some of the generalised information to answer the question from your perspective is really key and important. So there we go. You can contact your local information advice and support service. For your local information, I'm sure they have a phone line or a website. They will also have contact via email, etc. Or if you're unsure who to contact, you could always get in contact with Contact a Family, the free helpline there, which the number for that is 0808 808 3555. So don't hesitate if you're any concern, question, worry, what have you about this. Don't sit there suffering. Do ring and ask for help, because it's really important we get our heads around all these changes. So the bottom line with all this is really, you know, it's about success. It's about, you know, what does success look like for you, child, and your family. And really really don't forget that enshrined in legislation we now have this: parents and carers, children and young people are to be at the heart of the assessment and planning, to make sure your children achieve the best possible outcomes for the future. Because one of the things that I've learned is your children being children actually goes very, very quickly. And what we really need to think about in the long term is what's going to happen, and this may seem a real difficult question to ask ourselves, is are we really planning for the future? Because what's going to happen if something happens to us as the parents? And I know it's a really difficult question, but that was what really inspired me to start really thinking about creating a good quality plan for that would last not just for the moment through his education, not for just for this year, next year, but truly into the future. What was going to happen to him? Who would be there around him? Who were the people that were going to be there to support him? Where was he going to live? And who was he going to live with? What was he going to do all day, and what would that support look like? And I think, you know, certainly with the EHC plan opportunity now, we have an opportunity to test out the water, to find out what our children and young people's skills, gifts and qualities are. But ultimately, we can start to really work towards the future for them to live truly a good life as adults. Because let's face it, for many of us, you spend more time in adulthood working and doing all those things much longer and more many years than you ever did as a teenager. So it isn't just about planning for the now. Truly, this is the opportunity to start planning for the future. So I would say to you all, doesn't matter how old or young you may be, it's never too early to plan. And the other big thing that I would also say is you don't have to sit and wait for somebody to knock on your door to plan. We've got the choices. We can either plan and be part of it, or we can be planned for. When other folk plan for us, it doesn't always work out in the best way that we would choose. So take this opportunity, embrace this opportunity to actually work out and giving your children the really best chance they have in succeeding and living a real purposeful and meaningful life. And to finally round it up, I just want to ask any questions. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I hope you've understood it's helped you think and work some of this stuff out. I'm sure it creates far more questions than it gives you answers. So we'll do our best to answer any questions, and as we say, any of them in later on, we will put them on the website too. So budget in terms of our income line, no, it has no implications on disability living allowance currently at this moment in time. I'm not suggesting things are going to change, but no. In terms of the direct payments now, EHC, so E stands for education, health, H stands for health, C stands for care. Now currently direct payments can be a way to actually take down your assessed need of care and is a cash equivalent or a monetary equivalent of your care needs. So if you're assessed needing £100 worth of care a week, for example, with £100 that comes down in a direct payment, you can choose to use that money to actually employ people or indeed to actually procure your own type of service through a provider, organisation, agency, whatever you like. Now then, that does fit into the personal budget element, but what we need to be absolutely clear of is that that should be formulated as part of the plan. In the plan, you would have a responsibility working with whoever's helping you with the plan to actually very clearly define how that money is going to be spent, what it's going to be spent on, how it's going to be managed, and what outcomes you hope to achieve. So the direct payment in the context of it is a way of taking the personal budget. Yes, that fits in. The disability living allowance, no, because that's passed more down the income stream. I hope that's one question.
Okay, we have another question, Caroline. How old does a child have to be to qualify for a personal budget, and who instigates this? And that's a question from a parent whose child is 3 years old and has an education, health and care plan.
Okay, so there is some stuff around eligibility and who is eligible and who isn't. There is some information that's actually stating that children under the age of 2 who would be eligible would be children who are in receipt of disability living allowance. So that fits into the care element. So it depends on looking at the care needs, I guess. But arguably, if there is a component that is for care, yes, you can take that as a direct payment and deploy that in a way that maybe, of course, that would be part of the plan. So as young as is needed, really. So the DLA, if they meet that criteria, that will be used as a, are they eligible for the EHC?
Okay. We have another question. What can parents do if local authorities aren't complying with the legal requirements on timescales?
Well, you have, obviously there's the independent supporter that you could get to help and assist you, maybe to ask some questions. You could go through your parent carer forum. There's all the right to mediation, the right to appeal. You could go to tribunals, the whole process that you should be able to go through. Now, each local authority should give you information to the process of complaint or the process of appeal, and all them different ways that you can go through. Now, it depends on which aspect of the EHC plan. Is it an educational element? So there's that process of appeal, there's the mediation stuff within that. If it's health, you'd have to go down the health line. If it's care, again, down the social care line. It makes it a little bit complicated, but your independent supporters should be able to help hold your hand to navigate your way through who you would need to go through if you're unhappy with that process. And actually how they define the 20 weeks, you may need to ask that question too. So when did the process actually start? So what does that look like in terms of when did it finish? There's always kind of going to be a little bit of flexibility within there if more information needs to be gathered. So you need to kind of work out where you are in the process. But independent support is probably the best sort of call.
Okay, we have another question. Does a child need to have needs across education, health and care to have an education, health and care plan produced? So for example, if a child has an educational need but doesn't have any additional health needs?
No, the answer simply isn't, because some children may have an educational need but have no health or care needs. So, you know, it'd be looking at that child's individual needs from that element, so it wouldn't necessarily take you right through the EHC element. The bit that's probably, you know, most children have got some kind of health aspect or need some impact with health, and if that's just to keep them healthy, safe and well. Education, yes, that would fit in most children in this country and young people. The care element, it's more likely that the needs is going to be higher, more complex, you know, and actually are you eligible for care, and what is above and beyond what a child or young person would require alongside their peers. So it may be when the child is younger, the system may argue that the parents will have to provide significant care anyway. But as the gap widens, if you like, as the child or young person may grow older, they may not be eligible when they're younger for the care aspect, but they might just get older. It's really ensuring that that is continued to be reviewed, to be looked at, the whole family's needs taken into consideration, because family circumstances have implications on people's ability to continue to care for a child with additional support needs. So, you know, if there's lots of children in the family or other children with needs as well, that may be a different conversation. So again, get some advice, some information, advice and support services. Ask an independent supporter to help you and to make sure that you're getting all you're entitled to. So this is about entitlement. So just double check all the eligibility criteria. The hard bit with this is that it isn't a perfect science. We're talking about human beings, we're talking about person-centeredness. So that's really complicated in kind of saying here's the tick box. But get the eligibility stuff off your local authority, they should be able to produce it for each of the names.
So just following on from that, there's a question saying, can you explain a little bit more what you mean about person-centered approaches?
Okay, so person-centered approaches really does what it says on the tin. In terms of really looking at an individual child and in the context of that child, asking some questions. Really, if I was to say to you, what's important to your child? What would your child say is important to them? Whether they can speak or they can't speak, you know, what would they be saying? Another question I'd be asking is what's important for them. So as a family, what would you say are important for your children to keep them healthy, safe and well? And really thinking about all them elements of support that they would actually need. Other questions you might want to ask is what currently works in my child's life? What works around their education? What works around their health? What works around their care if they do indeed have care needs? And it isn't about fixing what isn't broken. The question you need to ask is what doesn't work, and actually start to use the EHC plan to work on the things that actually don't work for the now. Now, it'll never create a utopia or a perfect system, but what we're actually doing is trying to create a support mechanism around children and young people that makes sense for them. So children and young people might be able to cope in one setting but not another. It might be actually working in a much more flexible way to make sure that whatever their needs are, whatever times they are, that we get the support right around that individual child. So it's personable and individual to each of them children. So arguably, like I said, no plan should be exactly the same because we all have slight nuances and differences. It could have things in there like routines and rituals and what's really important for that child. So all them kind of things, putting that in together to actually create that real personalised education health care plan that makes sense for that individual child. Of course, as well, it's not fixed in stone. Things can evolve, things can change, you can have a change in needs. Sometimes developing a plan too soon with a little one, you might be trying to go up catching up with the plan all the time because children can evolve and change so quickly. So it's doing what's right in a way that makes sense for that child or young person, and really also thinking within that plan, what are our dreams, hopes and aspirations for the future? What's the goal? What's the longer term goal that we're setting as well? So all those kind of questions, there's lots of information on various websites across the Google Person-Centered. There's lots of things available that have been worked through with adults and young people and children. Look at some examples of some plans. Speak to different people if they've gone through the process too. But most importantly, think about asking your child or young person what matters to them.
So I have another question, Caroline, that's about how can you make sure the outcomes that you want for the child are the best outcomes for their lives?
That's a real tough one, I think. Sometimes, we want to think about the best outcomes for our children, and we may have aspirations for them. The thing that I always was mindful of is that it shouldn't just be me as Joe's mum working out what those kind of outcomes should be. Because am I the best person to actually plan for him? And what made me realise that was, I thought to myself, well, I want my mum to actually write my whole life plan. And probably some of you are chuckling now, and you get it around that context that really the views of the people are really key and important, because the people see our children in different lights. They see different things about them. They like and admire them in different ways, and I think it's really about the gathering of information, the gathering of opinion of other people to actually enable us to work out what is the context of the best outcomes for that child or young person. For many people that I speak to, for many families, when I'm facilitating a gathering, and that's a really good way of doing that, so gathering people together in a room with the child or young person and really do some visual planning with them. To actually say, in 5 years' time, what do we want to achieve, or 10 years' time, or 20 years' time, whatever that is, and to actually get a real joined-up approach around that. So what is the dream, the vision, the aspiration? Now, for me, and for my son, and for his circle around him, it was about something positive and meaningful to do. We didn't know actually what that was. We wanted him to get out and about in his own mode of transport. We wanted him to live with safe and secure in his own home. And we also wanted him to have real good friends around him. Now, with having that dream, we managed to work backwards in the steps to achieve that dream. And let me tell you, we achieved all those things. So believing in possibility, but also gathering good people together to help you work out what the best outcomes are for your child. And of course, don't forget them in the process too.
Okay. And we have another question, Caroline, and I think we might make this the last question, but I'll just come on and talk about all the questions we've had that we haven't been able to answer, is how are schools involved in the reforms?
The schools are very much involved in the reforms, whether they know all the finite detail that they need to know, because this will be a continual learning curve for them. And schools should be very much involved in particularly the development of the educational component of the plan. Really thinking about working in that very person-centered way with that child, which has huge implications to maybe sometimes the way that people are supported. But really also thinking about outcomes, not what we're putting in, but actually what do we get now. So how do we break down some of those smaller milestones to actually look at greater outcomes. So it's a huge learning curve for many of the schools. It will have big implications. It won't change overnight. As I mentioned before, this is more about cultural change and actually just ramming new policies into people. What we have to do is to feel the difference. And, the question on outcomes is, are we happy with our lot? Are we happy with what we're actually experiencing? Are our children happy? with the situation that they're in, and really that kind of educational system, that health work and that kind of care aspect, if they require it, are they achieving what we want them to achieve in terms of getting a good life and outcomes. So it isn't all about educational academic achievement, it's really about personal achievement, personal outcomes, and are we doing what makes sense to this child or young person. Big changes for schools, of course, big cultural shift, and I think it's about working together because, you know, after all, we do know our children pretty well, so if we can help the education system, I think we need to be involved where we can be. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm aware that we've had a lot of questions that we are not going to have time to answer today. We are contacting some people individually where your questions are very specific to ask if you're happy for us to pass them on to our specialist helpline, who will be able to provide you with that individual advice and information that you need. However, there's some that are more generic as well. So as we said earlier, what we'll do is we will collate all of the questions and produce a written response to them all that will be available with the webinar, so that you can see all of the questions that have been asked or would have been asked if we had time, with the answers for those. We really appreciate you all having given up your time tonight to come and listen to the webinar. We hope it's been helpful. We would really appreciate you filling in the evaluation form so you can tell us if it has or if it's not, if it's what you thought it would be, or what other kind of webinars might be helpful to you in the future. So I'd just like to say thank you again to Caroline, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Good night.